Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Andi Musyahidah Mawaddah, and I'm from PBI Class A. And here I'm going to tell you about the modern voice in prose and poetry. World War I produced a lot of prose and poetry, but the most famous only in the form of a novel. But in America, the best new novel appeared several years after the war occurred. The work comes from Ernest Hemingway. He has written several short stories and first-class novel entitled The Sun Also Rises. This novel made him one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. The Sun Also Rises is today considered as one of Hemingway's finest and literary classic. Another of Hemingway's best work is a novel titled Farewell to Arms. This novel is a classic fiction novel set in World War I. And this novel describes the heartbreaking love tragedy relationship between an American soldier and a British nurse. This story based on Hemingway's experience working as a volunteer in the First World War. After America took a role in the battle and disastrous withdrawal of Italian troops after a tremendous defeat, it caused a depression depicted in American literature, especially in the novel. This depression little affected Hemingway's attitude in writing. Besides Hemingway, another famous novelist is William Faulkner. He wrote a novel called Soldier's Pay, published in 1926, and Charteris, published 3 years later. In his novel, he described the character he used by using brilliant and complex literary technique to tell their story. His book made him world famous and won him a prize in 1920. The resurrection of modern poetry in America occurred in 1912. Harriet Monroe published Poetry, a magazine of verse. This magazine introduced many new American poets to the public. Its first issue revealed its purpose to give poetry its own place and voice. The general attitude shown by the new poets was that they rebelled against the philosophy of the Victorian poets who expressed themselves with conventional poetic technique. American poets feel that life is more complicated than what Romantic poets have said, for that they describe this difficult aspect of life with humor and irony. They believe that poetry should treat its object directly without much moralization and additional commentary, and only use words that can strengthen the poetry. In addition, rhythm must also appear in long phrases and avoid sentimental words and use indirect approach so that the reader can guess the meaning of the poem by themselves. Differs from poetry in 19th century, a new American poetry more intellectual and more based on the life is going on at the time. Another characteristic is that they focus on expressing only things that are important. In early 20th century, there was a poetic uprising for recognition of free verse. Free verse offers new insight into the various possible forms of verse. The poetry in America have reached its peak in the mid-20th century. Some of famous poets, namely like Wallace Stephen and his Harmonium and the Aurors of Autumn, T.S. Eliot and his The West Land, and Robert Frost and his North of Boston and New Hampshire, Hart Crane and his White Buildings and the Epic Cycle, The Bridge, Ezra Pound and the Cantus. I think that's all. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.